Cool. So like Anna shared, I'll be talking about child trauma, specifically about ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, toxic stress, and trauma-informed classrooms. And here are goals that Anna went over as well. Thanks for doing that. So trauma is a major area of passion for me in my work as a doctoral student. One of my roles is as a therapist for a community mental health nonprofit outside of Denver. We work with families and children who have recently experienced a crime or a traumatic event that has caused them to file for something called crime victim compensation. And that lets them seek services for free through surrounding counties of Denver. So in my work with these families, I've dealt with homicides, suicides, sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, substance abuse of parents, as well as other types of traumas. And we really work with the family system to heal. Each therapist has a member of the family, and there's a lot of flexibility to promote safety and stabilization, both individually and as a family. That could look like talking about boundaries in the home or teaching sex education to young kids who are survivors of sexual abuse. We also teach coping skills in order for them to safely process their trauma and integrate it into their lives. So it can be really heavy work, but I've realized just how important it is to give families a sound foundation to process and heal their trauma in order for them to stop the cycle of trauma in their lives and to be productive in their lives. So when I talk about trauma, it's really about the response, whether psychological, physiological, or emotional, to a negative event, or whether dangerous, scary, or violent, that occurs in someone's life. And trauma is usually considered that when it threatens their own life or their safety. For young kids, trauma can also include when an event is traumatic for a loved one, like a parent or caregiver, because if it threatens that adult's well-being or causes the death of them, then that child's safety and care is also closely connected to that and can impact their development and outcomes too. So you've probably heard trauma referred to as big T or little t trauma. So there are certain big T traumas that affect us profoundly. And as one psychologist describes it, trauma typically falls beyond the scope of normal human experience. According to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is a great resource for this kind of work, children and adolescents can be exposed to a variety of big T traumas, like natural disasters, community violence, bullying or harassment. I think of members of the LGBTQIA+ community in schools who are more likely to be harassed in school than their strict counterparts. Domestic violence or intimate partner violence, and that's either witnessing violence between parents or caregivers or being in an abusive relationship as teens themselves. Medical trauma, the impact of having a child who is experiencing cancer or another disease, perhaps a car accident, right? Or even the medical trauma of a parent and caregiver and what that family has to go through in hospitals and in appointments, right? That can be very traumatic. Also, physical or sexual abuse, refugee trauma, so having to escape a country because of war or persecution of the peoples, and also terrorism and other forms of mass violence. So that includes school shootings, public shootings, bombings, and other kinds of attacks. Some other things to mention about this big T trauma, grief can be traumatic. So that's especially true for kids when they experience the death of a close loved one. We refer to, for kids who have experienced trauma in ages 0 to 6, we refer to that as early childhood trauma. And then there's also something called complex trauma, and that's exposure to multiple events, typically severe and chronic, and in the form of abuse and neglect. And this is what I typically work with families who have a cycle of intergenerational trauma, where this trauma, these negative behaviors have been occurring throughout generations. So grandma has experienced, mom has experienced it, the child that I'm working with has experienced it. And so it becomes normalized in a family. And so we work to break that cycle. The common denominator for big T trauma for kids is that it threatens their life, their bodily safety, or the life and safety of a loved one. This really gives them a feeling of extreme helplessness and that they cannot effectively cope with the extent of the disintegration of their internal self and their external reality. So it kind of shatters their sense and perception of self and of the world. The fascinating thing about trauma is that a person's trauma response or how the trauma affects their well-being is very much contingent on other factors. just as I talked about with mental health and that biopsychosocial model, this applies to trauma as well. So, for example, not every veteran who comes back from war develops post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD symptoms, right? It has a lot to deal with the person's perceptions about the event that occurred, their ability to tolerate the distress that they're under, past experiences of trauma, and their ability to process the event without avoiding the symptoms. So for kids, their trauma response and outcomes are heavily contingent on the duration. So how long the trauma occurred. Was it a one-time single event, or did this happen over a course of years? The intensity of it, really lending itself to, physical and sexual abuse and the intensity of those interactions with the perpetrator. Also the timing. So thinking about the critical timing in children's lives, when does this abuse and neglect and trauma occur? Also the context of the stressful experience. Did they suffer from trauma at the hand of a loved one, or was it a stranger, right? All of these things play into the trauma response and the likelihood of outcomes. Little t traumas definitely exist too, though. These are less intense events that happen on a more personal level, but can still impact a sense of self and the emotional functioning, but these are not life-threatening. So while little t traumas don't typically impact a person enough to have PTSD-related symptoms, the smaller scale instances of trauma can negatively impact the well-being of kids because they build up over time and they're often ignored. And so they cause harm just as well. And research has shown that repeated exposure of little t trauma can actually create more emotional repercussions than being exposed to a single big T trauma event. So let's talk about long-term events or long-term outcomes of child trauma. So there was a study in the late 1990s called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, or ACEs, which is kind of like the term that we use for it. This was the first study to find a direct link between experiences of childhood trauma and negative health outcomes in those same adults as they grew older. So ACEs are defined as a stressful or traumatic event that occurs for children before 18 years old. There's 3 types of ACEs, and that spans 10 distinct events. So with abuse, that can be physical, emotional, or sexual. Neglect, physical or emotional. And then you have this other category called household dysfunction, which really lends itself to parent interactions with children. So that can look like mental illness of a parent, abuse towards a parent, so witnessing some domestic violence, divorce, substance abuse of a parent, and having an incarcerated relative. Overall, this study was groundbreaking because it found that the greater number of ACEs a child experiences, the greater possibility of disabilities and dysfunction that they experience later in life as adults. This is pretty eye-opening. As a population, over 2 experience at least one ACE in their life. And for people of color, that number is up to 83%. So this is pretty common. Most of us have experienced at least one of these ACEs in our lives as children. So I love this period so much. It's about how ACEs can affect the healthy growth and development of children and increase the prevalence of risk factors for later health problems. So I'm going to walk us through it. So I'm going to walk us through it from the bottom to the top. So thinking about adverse childhood experiences in that very critical time of like conception to young adulthood, experiencing one or more ACEs, through that, a child's neurodevelopment is impacted, meaning that their brains develop patterns differently than those children who don't experience much unhealthy stress. So without getting into too much neuroscience, this is how kids become dysregulated emotionally and socially. So MRI studies have shown that there are changes in the brain structure of kids who have experienced trauma. So this happens at a cellular level, right, where what we experience can actually rewire our brains to behave in different ways, and that without proper therapy and treatment, that can last throughout your entire life, which is kind of how this pyramid is built. So that rewiring is really in part not being able to be attuned to a caregiver because the caregiver is harmful to them, not having their needs met, not learning soothing or coping skills at a long age. So all of the lack of all of that support really can set kids up for potentially atypical social, emotional, and cognitive development. So we know that trauma is one factor of many in terms of impacting mental health, right? But it is a big factor, especially when we think about how trauma events can shift the perceptions of kids when it comes to how they think about adults, how they think about the value of school, how they relate to their peers, and just life in general. So if a child experiences an ACE and develops social anxiety, for instance, over time, as he gets older, he may seek out drugs or alcohol or other risk-taking behaviors to fit in with his peers, to feel social and normal around them. So over time, if he keeps up this drinking, that could put him at risk for diseases related to that. And that can impact, as an adult, impact his functioning at work, his family life if left untreated. So ultimately, the adoption of a health risk behavior early in life can increase the likelihood of health problems and early death. And that is why what we are doing in creating health and wellness plans and prevention strategies is so important for all kids, but especially for those who have found themselves somewhere on this pyramid. And we want to make sure that they're not working their way up through the pyramid to an early death. Here is a more detailed list of outcomes that have been linked to ACEs. As you can see, trauma can touch all areas of our life, our behaviors, meaning how we cope with trauma, and especially if that trauma is not processed, as well as how trauma can impact our physical and mental health. So as you can see, these are probably all connected to the pyramid, and we can put them all places on that pyramid I just showed. So if we don't have a sense of well-being as children and teenagers and don't learn to cope with what we've experienced, we seek out risky behaviors to cope instead. Like using drugs, skipping work, smoking, not taking our physical health as important, right? So I just want to make sure that we make this point clear that development happens on a continuum and blends into each other. So it's really never too early to intervene and help kids out in order for them to prevent these kinds of things from happening. Also, trauma is intergenerational, meaning that the impact of trauma is passed down through our genes from parents to children. So in other words, we inherit our parents' trauma, and the kids who are in school right now, their kids are going to inherit their own trauma, right? So I'm fascinated by this idea, and there's a book called It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wolin, and it really highlights how we can use lifestyle choices like exercise and meditation and healthy eating to change our gene expression or epigenetics to heal from intergenerational trauma. It's a great book. It's a heavy read, but if you are more interested in this, that is a great book to start with. So how do ACEs create negative health outcomes, right? It's about toxic stress. That's the link for how ACEs affect children's bodies. So basically, toxic stress is how our body reacts because of the stress that they're experiencing. Toxic stress in this model for children was developed in the early 2000s to describe effects of the excessive activation or overload of the stress response from trauma on children's developing brain and body. So this extends everywhere, their metabolism, their heart, their digestion, executive functioning, mental health, pretty much every aspect of their body, puberty, right? Trauma can affect. It's really important to know that stress isn't necessarily a bad thing. We can have positive stress responses that promote healthy development and teach our body how to react. Like think about a child's first day at school, right? Or getting a vaccination. That stress can feel like a rise in heart rate and a slight elevation in hormone levels, but our body supports us through it. And then we have tolerable stress, and that can look like a death, a natural disaster, getting injured. Some of those things that I mentioned with types of trauma, right? It can be more severe. It may have long-lasting consequences, but our bodies can recover if the activation of the system, if that stress response has an end, and there's adults to help the child through it. And that's really key. So kids can experience trauma and stress, but it's really mediated and long-terms are prevented by having supportive adult relationships. So then we get into this problem area of toxic stress. And this is when the child experiences stress that is severe, chronic, and could be considered a prolonged adversity. So those traumas that I talked about. And it becomes toxic without adequate adult support. And this is really huge. The fact that we've talked about this a lot, the power of one adult in a child's life to help them work through this. So what toxic stress really looks like and feels like in the body is it's like revving an engine for days or weeks at a time, and it leads to long-lasting wear and tear on the body and the brain. And this is called like a child's allostatic load, right? Like the amount of stress that a child can take. And if they don't have the coping skills or those protective relationships to handle that stress, their allostatic load becomes an allostatic overload, where the body reacts poorly because it's overwhelmed with all of the stress. And then they seek out those health risk behaviors, and then it kind of goes into that chain of negative health outcomes as adults. So now I kind of want to shift gears. That was a lot of like heavy content, right? So now we're going to talk about trauma-informed care. And I'm really obsessed with this graphic, so I'm going to walk us through it. But first, I want to define what trauma-informed care is. So the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard is a great resource for what I just talked about, toxic stress, ACEs, all of that. And their understanding of trauma-informed care is that problematic behaviors need to be treated as a result of ACEs or other traumatic experiences someone has had, as opposed to addressing problematic behaviors as a willful action or a punishable action. So thinking about, as we walk through this, this graphic, what lies beneath this behavior that the child is having? Are they trying to meet a need for themselves that they haven't gotten met by a caregiver? Does it have to deal with their developmental age? Is it the current state of their nervous system? Meaning, do they come into school so heightened with stress and anxiety from what they experienced in the morning that the only thing that they can do is act out in order to kind of like facilitate their stress response and get it out of their system? Or on the other hand, do they come in so disengaged because their nervous system is shut down because they've decided to flee the stressful situation that they experienced at home? So is it a matter of their nervous system? Is that behind the behavior, beneath the behavior? And kind of what I just talked about, that survival response. Is their behavior about fighting that response, flighting, like leaving it, freezing, or appeasing? So there's also this idea, you probably heard of fight or flight, right? There's also freeze and appease. So appease is people pleasing, right? Where they tend to kind of blend into whatever an adult wants them to do because they've been groomed to do that. From their abuser, right? Or from a traumatic experience. Are they using a negative coping strategy that doesn't really work for them? Because we all know we have seen negative coping strategies in kids. Does it have to do with their brain structure and how they've been wired because of what they've experienced? Are they kind of panicking because of the conditioning that they've experienced? And really, at the end of the day, how is this problem behavior actually the child's solution to try to communicate with you? So some things I want to point out and make sure that we all understand is that I know that not every child in your classroom has experienced trauma. We know this. However, there may be some children who have, and you probably don't know it. So what I want to make clear is that it's not our job to be investigators. We're not here trying to figure out a child's trauma, right? We don't need to know the details of that, but we do have a responsibility to create a safe, empathetic, and secure space for them. Because in so many instances, school is a haven for kids who deal with adversity and trauma at home. So they could, we know that they could be acting out as a result of the trauma they've experienced. And trauma can permeate any and all aspects of a child's life. It really creates a rupture in trust in relationships for kids. And that includes how they relate to others. So even though you didn't cause the trauma, they still might relate to you in that way, right? So that's why it's so important to have a trauma-informed lens when working with kids, because we really just don't know. And the things that I'm going to share about how we can make a trauma-informed classroom benefits all kids, but especially those who have been impacted by trauma. So as a school psychologist, I'm particularly interested in how trauma can manifest in students and how that plays out in academics and other areas. So as teachers and as educators, there are a variety of things that we can look for. So first, trauma can look like anxiety. So that can, in children, that could seem as being withdrawn, shy, or overly sensitive. Children may also be distracted because they're so in their heads and replaying something or engaging in repetitive play that it can really make it difficult for them to focus on the content because they're still reliving what they had to deal with at home. Also, language deficits. For some kids that I've worked with, they have trouble connecting words to experiences because their brain is so fragmented, which can actually cause receptive and expressive language delays. Then we also have aggression. So again, with that trauma response and acting out, some of these kids have a really short fuse because that's how they've learned to kind of adapt to what they've been experiencing. Also, executive functioning deficits. So the fact that trauma really does affect the brain functioning in terms of planning, organizing, and solving problems. So again, trauma impacts, the holistic development of children. So as far as how we can create a trauma-informed classroom, again, you don't need to know who's experienced trauma to set a good example and help kids heal through example. So the first area is relationships and being that power of one, right? So one of the most important things that you can do in a classroom is to build trust and safety. Some kids have parents who consistently break promises. So as a teacher, if you forget about offering that you offered a break, or perhaps you offered extra recess and you forget because the day is stressful, it might seem small to you, but to a child who is untrustworthy of adults, it's a big deal to them and confirms their perception that they can't trust adults. It's really important to show interest in your students. That might be the only time that any adult is interested in them, because perhaps their parents are disengaged in parenting, right? And so they come to school and they want your attention and they want to please you. It's also important to model positive functioning relationships with others in the building. So be an example, not just in your relationship with that child, but in all the ones that you're facilitating in school. And relationships are actually the number one way to regulate the nervous system. So by creating a secure connection with someone, our brain actually releases oxytocin to help our bodies calm down and actually be in that relationship with the other person. Second, promoting predictability. So some kids may have a parent who is very affectionate one day and buys them, a whole bunch of toys. And then the next day, that same parent might abuse them when they're under the influence of drugs. So you can promote predictability in your classroom by building in routines and sticking to them. So for instance, you can write down, the day's schedule on the board and prepare students for transition. So for example, we're going to be cleaning up in 5 minutes and then we're going to the sports field, and then sticking to that routine and showing them that you mean what you say and that you're going to follow through. Also predictability with your response too. So treating students in the same way and having a calm and effective response. Also setting clear expectations and reducing chaos in the classroom are great ways to promote predictability. Then as far as regulation goes, some of these kids, like I mentioned, they're always on high alert or they're completely zoned out. And they're going to come into your classroom like this. And so their lack of regulation may be how they've learned to get an adult's attention or communicate their needs or communicate their confusion, their frustration, or their anger. So for kids who have dealt with toxic stress or have hit an allostatic overload, they become dysregulated a lot easier than their peers. So we have to provide opportunities to regulate and to kind of get them back down to base, because if a kid is so escalated that they can't even access the curriculum, then they're going to present to you as someone who doesn't know their stuff or who is completely not wanting to be involved. But that's not the case. They just can't access what you're trying to teach them because of their heightened nature. So this can look like movement breaks. It can look like, a minute of silence or a minute of meditation or mindfulness, right? Just building in little things throughout the day to help them to kind of release their stress and manage their allostatic overload. Next is creating calm. So creating spaces, whether physical or emotional, calm spaces in the classroom. So in the midst of a trauma response, whether fighting, flighting, or freezing, kids can't reason and perhaps not really explain what's wrong. So the best thing that you can do is, instead of punishing them or raising your voice, you can give them a space to calm down. And then once they get back to base, then you can have a productive conversation with them. For kids to go calm down and regulate themselves, you can have a quiet corner to decompress, having blankets, maybe a whiteboard to draw, pieces of paper to journal, an iPad to access a mindfulness app, or a game to get them out of their heads, maybe a yoga mat for our more active-minded students. And if it can't be in your classroom, perhaps it can be in the nurse's office or somewhere otherwise. When I worked in a high school in Ohio, it was the nurse's office that kids were asked to go to calm down. Or you can just let them excuse themselves to the restroom if that's the only option, which is still a great option. There's also this thing called power with strategies, and that's versus power over strategies. So for some kids who've experienced trauma, they experience a loss of control or power at the hands of their abuser, whether parent, caregiver, stranger, whoever. So it's really important to provide collaboration, choice, and give students a voice to help kids understand that not that they're necessarily equals with you, but they have power with you to heal from this instead of you exerting power over them and keeping them in that box that they've experienced their abuse or neglect within. And lastly, you probably know what I'm going to tell you. I've mentioned this in multiple echo sessions. You have to take care of yourself in order to take care of others. So a self-regulated adult is the only person that's going to be able to help self-regulate a kid, right? If we're frazzled and we're creating chaos and we're not able to be predictable with ourselves, then how can we be a good model for these kids who need to see that from an adult that they probably haven't, right? They don't have that positive relationship at home. So really all of these strategies can help build social emotional skills, resiliency, and support post-traumatic growth. So I like just to take 2 minutes to reflect on the strategies I just mentioned. These strategies are not supposed to add to your load as an educator, but rather it's about how you can shift your established practices and classroom management to become more trauma-informed. So for 2 minutes, I just want you to take some notes about what you can shift in your work with your students to make your space more trauma-informed. And I'll flip back to the previous slides so you guys can see the strategies again. So just take 2 minutes. And then I'll bring us back.
Hey, Ellie. For me, your internet went out a little bit when you just gave that instruction. Could you just repeat what you want people to do again?
Yeah, sure. So just take 2 minutes to reflect on the strategies that I mentioned and how to create a trauma-informed classroom. And this is really not about adding to your load as an educator, but just shifting some of your classroom management styles to become more trauma-informed. So just take some notes about what you can do. And we'll go from there. So there's the strategies. Got about a minute left. All right, cool. So as you guys are wrapping up, I just want to leave you with a couple ideas. So this is how I view my work as a therapist, and I think we can really apply it to our work in schools too. So before trauma therapy, trauma can permeate all aspects of a child's life, their self-worth, their relationships, their ability to regulate. It takes over their minds and their bodies, and it really shatters a lot of their well-being. And what we work towards in therapy is being able to integrate trauma into the rest of their lives. So putting the pieces back together, and their trauma experience being an additional one that is part of them, but doesn't permeate their whole existence. So the overall goal is to be able to weave it into the fabric of their lives through effective processing. So it's the idea that, those who have experienced trauma can absolutely develop self-respect, positive feelings, and healthy attachments to people. So our students, with our help and support, can shrink the impact of their trauma and begin to heal and integrate it into their lives through our empathy, our awareness, and by creating trauma-informed environments to facilitate this healing. And then this is just a quote I wanted to share. So adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. But this is treatable and it's beatable. The single most important thing that we need today is the courage to look at this problem in the face and say, this is real and this is all of us, and to say that we are the movement. So I hope that you get some good tools out of this today, and that you kind of think about it in terms of yourself and the students that you work with, and the idea that this is something that we can all work towards eliminating in school. Thanks.
For more information about Project ECHO and upcoming ECHOs with the University of Denver, please visit mortgage.du.edu/ECHO or follow us on Twitter at ECHO_DU_MCE. Thanks for watching.